When it comes to the history of Yu-Gi-Oh, there are many paths one could take. Normally, we look at the releases, the meta, that sort of stuff, but today I want to take a branching path and go over a specific archetype that has survived the test of time. We are, of course, talking about Gravekeepers. I've enlisted the assistance of fellow Yu-Gi-Oh fanatic Kui, YouTube links in the script, who not only helped in researching this topic, but you'll hear from her throughout this video. In terms of the TCG, this was the game's first proper archetype, which is to mean a pattern or support revolving around a group of cards. Blue Eyes and Dark Magician hadn't had their support yet, and Toons, which debuted in 2002, were still no more than a monster ability. Gravekeepers, on the other hand, came out swinging with plenty of Gravekeepers monsters and support to back up their game plan. The archetype in review are dark spellcasters based around ancient Egyptian tomb keepers, not unlike the Ishtar family from the Yu-Gi-Oh manga and anime. The cards would lean into this as they would receive more support. In terms of strategy, they typically are about using the field spell card, Necro Valley, to lock the graveyard out of any card that would banish or move another card from it, essentially preventing grave robbers. This floodgate, or an effect that prevents duelists from performing a certain action, completely shuts down cards like Monster Reborn and Chaos Monster Summoning. Gravekeepers were first introduced in Pharaonic Guardian on July 8, 2003, with quite the plethora of cards. Prominent monsters include Gravekeeper's Assailant to switch monster positions upon attack, Guard to return monsters back to the hand, Spear Soldier for piercing damage, and Spy to special summon another Gravekeeper from the deck upon its flip summon. These were some solid, general effects that allowed for toolbox usage in both offense and defense. Spy would be the most popular monster out of the freshman lineup for its high defense and field presence. There were a few support monsters, however the real usable support would be the back row cards. Necro Valley upon release negated all effects that manipulated the graveyard. Plus, all Gravekeeper monsters gain 500 attack and defense. Like I mentioned earlier, this puts a stop to grave play, and if you were running this, your deck could take advantage of this as well, since you wouldn't be running Premature Burial yourself. But a card like Sinister Serpent, Sangan, or Vampire Lord that moved itself or activated from the grave is fair game. The 500 buff was nothing to laugh at either, since now you had powerful effect monsters with upwards of 2k attack and 25k defense. Offense may not be Gravekeeper's core strategy, but it does add aggression to otherwise controlled gameplay. Necro Valley throughout Yu-Gi-Oh has received a generous amount of erratas to adjust its power, and yet the idea of what the card is used for remains true.
The other two cards are Rite of Spirit and Royal Tribute. Rite of Spirit is a trap card to revive a Gravekeeper that bypasses the lock of Necro Valley. Royal Tribute is a spell card that when Necro Valley is up, both players discard all monsters from their hands. A powerful spell when used at the right moment. With this, you could send your opponent's monsters to the grave and keep them there. Just be careful that the card hits its mark and doesn't screw you over either.
Pharaonic Guardian would first be legal in Yada format, which, from a limited pool of tournament results, we only know from the 2003 World Championships. GKs would not be present in any capacity during this time. In fact, it would be quite some time before we see a deck list for the archetype. So, going off of their format debut, they do fit fairly well in Tomato Control. Mystic Tomato can float into 15k or lower dark monsters, which almost all GKs fit into this threshold. If Necro Valley was on the field, Spear Soldier and Assailant could both be Tomato searchable 2000 attack monsters with upside. You just have to keep a watch out for the plethora of back row removal during this time because decks relying on field spells tend to be rather glassy. In 2004, Chaos variants and OTK decks ran rampant. Even though Necro Valley counters the Chaos plan, the fact that the environment was filled with power-hungry decks that could break through Necro Valley was undeniable. You could already be facing an established Chaos board, or have to struggle against the plethora of available back row removal, or just simply attempt to deal with beatdown variants. Anti-meta decks could not keep up to speed as shown from all the historical events at the time, but who am I to say that a retrospective mindset wouldn't give GKs a boost in power?
So that leads us into 2005 and the most famous of all dual monster era formats, GOAT format. Coming in at top 8 at SJC Indianapolis in August of 2005, we have Daryl Jessler's build that kicked off the meta history of Gravekeepers. This 42-card deck incorporated plenty of GK monsters, Assailant, Spy, and Spear Soldier, and appeared to combat the popular trend at the time, Control. DD Warrior Lady, Tribe Infecting Virus, and Tsukiyomi, these were all used in effort to counter Goat Control, plus Suk worked with Spy. And Necro Valley would hurt the possible plays of Blackluster Soldier and Chaos Sorcerer. After all, Spear Soldier could pierce right through those weak scapegoat tokens, and Assailant could turn them into attack position if Necro Valley was on the field. With 3 Rite of Spirits, the deck wanted to keep an aggressive field presence and just added to the topping power that GK showed. But the deck also showcased its weaknesses. For one, Delinquent Duo could deprive you of the necessary Necro Valley, and without that, the locks and power of effects of GKs were greatly stifled. Spy was a prime target for Nobleman of Crossout, and the deck had problems with big monsters once resources were deprived. All in all, Jessler's Gravekeeper deck was momentum-based, for better or for worse.
Before the deck's next top, the core set Force of the Breaker would be released on May 16, 2007, featuring Gravekeeper's Commandant, however you pronounce that. This strong 4-star 16k monster could be discarded from your hand to add Necro Valley straight from the deck to your hand. This meant you could avoid terraforming from getting stopped, and you had a monster if need be. Plus, with such a high attack, its boosted power could go to 21k, which for a 4-star monster is nothing to laugh at. Commandant would make for a great addition to the GK repertoire. In mid-2008, at the end of Gladiator format, right before the 5Ds era, the World Championship saw a surprising top 8 Gravekeeper deck by Chris Gehring. Gehring's list reflected the playstyle Gravekeepers would be best known for. Stun. The plan is simple. Make sure your opponent doesn't get the chance to fight back and crush them into sand upon the Necro Valley. However, this wouldn't be what we may be familiar with quite yet, as this iteration was Gravekeeper Burn. The idea wasn't a new concept, as Comic Odyssey Burn had been combining Stun and Burn since Perfect Circle format in 2007. We even saw a machine variant around that time too. So why not take this and incorporate GKs and their inherent floodgate strategy? Well, that's what Gehring did with plenty of the stun cards of that time. Skill Drain, Dark Bribe, Solemn Judgment, Messenger of Peace, etc. Cyber Valley added much needed speed, and a Cat of Ill Omen could add a trap straight to your hand should Necro Valley be on the field. And even if it wasn't, Cyber Valley could get you more draws to top deck that added trap. Comic Odyssey? No, this was an Egyptian Odyssey. It was sound enough to make top 16 at SJ Edison years later in 2010. Speaking of 2010, then on February 16th, the core set Absolute Power Force came out with a slew of GK support. Gravekeeper's Priestess and Visionary would appear here, however the other 2 cards would be the real heavy hitters, Gravekeeper's Descendant and Steel, however you pronounce that. Descendant's effect is that you tribute one other face-up GK monster to destroy one card your opponent controls. It added much needed destructive power to the GK library, great if not for the downside of its cost. Then Steel is a spell card that could recur 2 GK monsters from your grave to hand, ignoring Necro Valley, much like Rite of Spirit. This gave the deck a solid GK generator for 2 GKs without having to wait a turn for a trap. It also comboed with Descendant for effect fuel.
This revamped Gravekeepers had an additional advantage, as Royal Tribute inherently grew in power as the meta itself progressed. Tribute was first released in a meta where powerful spells reigned supreme, but by now, most competitive decks were more than 50% monster, leading to more monster-filled opening hands. Combine that with the more efficient searching of Necro Valley provided by Commandant, and the probability of a devastating turn 1 Tribute had greatly increased. Everything fell into place with the release of Starstrike Blast in 2010, which brought with it the final proverbial piece of the post-mortem preserver's puzzle, Gravekeeper's Recruiter. The added search power, which itself could be searched by Spy and sacrificed by Descendant, was enough to finally lead Yu-Gi-Oh's oldest archetype to its first major win. In November of 2010, Fraser Smith took first place at YCS Atlanta. Surprisingly, his build only played 2 Necro Valley with his 3 Royal Tribute, seemingly depending on Commandant to find the field spell and avoid drawing redundant copies in the late game. The deck could also take advantage of 3 Pot of Duality due to the relatively low amount of special summoning it did compared to other decks. Smith gave the GK deck a sole identity as the anti-meta Iron Man we know today. A year later, Jonathan Wagle would get second place at YCS Anaheim with a similar list. Throughout the years, we would see similar Gravekeeper decks that would continue in the line of stun decks. They incorporated punishing cards like Starlight Road and Malefics, which worked well as a strong boss monster that paired with Necro Valley since they needed a field spell to be on the field. Gravekeepers would get 1 major top a year, then until 2014. That same year, Legacy of the Valiant would give the archetype the most cards it had gotten since its original release. Aside from Gravekeeper's Oracle, of whom would get the limelight eventually, the most notable among these were Hidden Temples and Imperial Tombs of Necro Valley. The first was a continuous spell that blocked all special summons, and the second was a counter trap that could negate and destroy any spell, trap, or monster effect. The only catch was that you had to have both the Gravekeeper and Necro Valley on the field at the same time to use them. This was hardly a drawback in the early game, but required the Gravekeeper player to have some momentum in order to make them work.
Still, 2014 would be the last high point in GK's TCG history when Andre Pinzon topped again with Gravekeepers as he did a year prior, this time with a hand Gravekeeper build, because at that time, Fire and Ice hands, pretty good. You gotta hand it to Pinzon. In early 2017, Duelist Saga would get released, and Necro Valley would receive an errata to negate cards that change type or attribute in the graveyard. So yeah, take that, zombie world. A few months after that, GKs would come back to the top 16 at the Winchester Regionals, using many new, powerful traps like Dimensional Barrier and Solemn Strike. Of course, adapting already existing cards like Fossil Dyna and Imperial Tombs only helped. Even adding in Card of Demise gave the trap-heavy lineup more draw power to make the deck a contender once again. The following year in October would be Soul Fusion's release, and with it a new slew of support. Gravekeeper's Headman, Spiritualist, Supernaturalist, Necro Valley Throne, and Necro Valley Temple. This injected new life into GKs in terms of how one could approach playing them. Supernaturalist was an extra deck boss monster when those were all the rage, and Throne became an excellent searching or summoning tool depending on what you needed it for. But will they have an effect on their meta identity? Let's find out in their final top as of this video. Evan Smith got top 16 at Dublin, Ireland regionals in January 2020 using many of the cards we just talked about. This was everything Gravekeepers compiled into one stunning deck. Spy, Commandant, Descendant, Spiritualist, Royal Tribute, it's all there. Plus with even more traps and draw power like Pot of Desires and Crackdown, new cards just meant GKs could only benefit from an ever-expanding card pool.
Though this was the end of Gravekeeper's glory in advance, they found new vitality as a top-tier deck in the early Speed Duel metagame. Gravekeepers were one of the best decks in Speed Duel's first format, taking advantage of a skill that permanently acted as Necro Valley to make easy use of Hidden Temples. A month later, the Lucky Day Gravekeepers deck would be invented, combining the Joey skill It's My Lucky Day with Dice Spoon for the format's most efficient back row removal. Both variants were tier 1 at the time, headed by Gravekeeper's Oracle as a devastating finisher. There was also a Gravekeeper's Bird deck in Speed Duel. It combined Burn All-Stars, Nightmare Wheel, Zoma the Spirit, and Lava Golem with Gravekeeper's Curse to stall and deal incidental burn damage, all of which worked with the Twisted Personality skill to discard or destroy problem cards. The deck was rounded out with compact Gravekeeper engine of Recruiter, Rite of Spirit, and one Oracle for a potential aggressive finish.
From their pharaonic beginning, Gravekeepers have been showing up to the Yu-Gi-Oh party, metaphorically speaking. Typically adopting a control style, the deck has proven to be one of, if not the game's most adaptive deck. While it may have never been a consistent tier 1 contender, it did gain some victories here and there.
It's even found some success in modern GOAT format. User Mr. Big Noodle topped GOAT format's Premium World Championship Qualifier 2 with a more minimalist GK deck, adopting an anti-meta beatdown strategy, and I myself won PWCQ 14 with Gravekeeper Warriors. Perhaps one day, Gravekeeper Zombies, a variant that doesn't even run Necro Valley, will push itself to a top spot as well.
From GOAT to Gladiator to Edison to Star Strike, from 2005 to 2020 to infinity and beyond, the TCG's first archetype clearly have taken their eternal job seriously. As one of my favorite decks of the time, I can't talk about the Tomb Keepers enough. Who's to say GKs won't become meta relevant once again? Odds are, it's only a matter of time. And I'm a betting man.